The plantation system which existed throughout the Western world began some 600 years ago. The Caribbean was also exposed to practice of slavery. During the period of slavery throughout the Caribbean, plantation slavery was the economic life of the plantocracy. The triangular slave trade saw Africans being shipped from the Ivory Coast, West and Central African to the Caribbean. Africans were captured by their fellow Africans during periods of civil wars and the raids on villages with little or no defense system. The triangular slave trade saw the captured Africans being brought to the Caribbean and being forced to work on large sugar cane plantations. The produce grown on these large farms were shipped to Europe where it was sold. The monies collected for the goods sold in Europe was used to purchase new slaves for the region, Caribbean. This cycle continued for several years, until the slave trade was abolished in 1838. During the period of slavery, various aspects of Caribbean economic, social and political sphere was structured. This period saw the Creolization, acculturalization and interculturalization of the inhabitants of the Caribbean region. The Caribbean created a distinct cultural trait which became symbiotic of both the slavery era and the early years of apprenticeship. In 1972, George Beckford suggested in several papers that the Caribbean mirrors a plantation society, using the description of the organization of the plantation system to comprehend why the Caribbean economic and social situation is the way it is. This paper is aimed at evaluating the plantation, Creole and plural framework which is pronounced throughout the Caribbean region. An understanding of what is meant by the plantation society should help in the understanding of how society functions. Throughout the Caribbean there is a vast range of cultural diversity. This range of culture in existence has its roots primarily in history and the impact of slavery. When carefully assessed, the plantation system as described by George Beckford mirrors a system of vast inequality similar to that which existed during the era of slavery. It can be argued that the plantation system of the Caribbean have influenced the economic, social, political and cultural life of the Caribbean. It is believed that this system saw the exploitation of the enslaved to gain economic prosperity. Slavery was officially ended in 1838. Yet the practices of this era can still be felt throughout every social, economic, political and social sphere of the Caribbean society. The plantation model saw a more autocratic/dictatorial. The Caribbean society during the era of slavery was rigidly guarded with specific rules. Education, politics, social order and economics were specific and purposeful. The white plantation owners established the rules so as to maintain their rule and governance. All coloreds, Maltos and whites adhered to the rules. These rules in many cases meant life or death to all non-whites. Whites who defied the rules were seen as traitors and were faced with the same dilemma as did the coloreds on the plantation. Life as it existed on the plantation saw many inequality and abuse by those set in charge. The plantation owner held a bag with the rewards for all which he has working for him. The decision to reward slaves was never guided by any United Nations law or stipulation on the rights of the worker. No law existed which protected the non-whites on the plantation. The only opportunity for justice rested with the Assembly, which was the meeting place for all the plantation owners within the varied islands. The government of the day was a representative of the monarch sent from the monarch itself in Spain, Britain, France and the Netherlands. The high production rate of the sugar plantation meant higher return through taxes for the monarch, thus it had no vested interest in limiting or preventing the production of varied produce throughout the Caribbean. This ideology of the monarch led to several abuses by plantation owners and white aristocrats. Slave labor was intense and required severe measures which were aimed at increasing production and minimizing expense for the plantation owners. The culture of the plantation saw white as superior. The field slaves would opt to work in the house in which the plantation owner lived. They wanted to be around their white masters. They had a better social and healthful life. They performed the task of washing, cleaning, cooking and the performances of sexual favors for the owners. To a great extent the idea of being white or brown is preferred by many Caribbean nationals on the sugar plantation. Many female slave mothers would at times request that their young girls are promoted to house slaves. It was their intention that they would become pregnant by the master and would eventually have a baby that is white or mulattoes. This gave the hope that the child would one day become prominent in society and help his or her family members. Today in the social sphere, there is a common belief that the color white and/or brown is superior to the color pigment black. Many African Americans and Caribbean nationals consider it a shame and disgrace to be black. They have designed ways in which they transform themselves into a lighter skin tone. To these people it is felt that they are more beautiful. The plantation owners did look for the better-looking and lighter-color females to work in the house as house slaves. In the present Caribbean societies in which we live in today, this ideology is still common. Many employers will not employ persons whom are considered black. The ideology of a good-looking employee mirrors persons with light skin and pretty hair. Although the mulattoes were never considered as having the same status as the whites throughout the Caribbean, they had more privileges than those deemed as blacks. A similar contrast can be drawn in many Caribbean societies during the earlier years of colonization. In Jamaica, persons working as receptionists and in the banks as tellers and clerks had to be of a light skin tone. The black workers had their work at the back of the building or out of the sight of the clients whom may visit the office. The inequality of this nature spawned beyond the realms of the workplace. Many traditional secondary schools had white teachers who came from England. This situation reminds us that during the era of plantation slavery the whites had the power to manipulate the accomplishments of the blacks. Slaves never had rights. Every slave were owned by a white planter. Although a slave may become free, he was always viewed as a Niger. If he failed to show his papers which indicated his freedom, he would be subjected to slavery and be considered as a runaway slave. The punishment for this may result in death or several lashes. Today assumptions are made about individuals based on how they look. The color of a person's pigmentation automatically suggests that individual has some sort of wealth. Of course this assumption is not always correct. The imitation of the wealthy planters by slaves who lived on the plantation during slavery was common. They, the house slaves, would at times forget where they came from and boast on those working in the fields. Within the era of slavery the elevation to house slave meant a sort of upward social mobility. They, the slave, consider themselves moving upward the social hierarchy. The continuation of the plantation system which existed during slavery still exists today. The Caribbean society today mirrors governance, social stratification, education and politics which existed during slavery. Politics today reflects nepotism just as in the days of colonialism. If you are aligned to a particular political persuasion of the day, you are in line to receive wealth, employment and social status. During the days of slavery the assemblies controlled the governance of the varied Caribbean societies. Health benefits for all assembly members whom were mostly plantation owners existed. Plantation owners had special arrangement to have their children be sent to colleges and universities in Britain. Later teachers were sent from England to teach the children of planters. Blacks were rarely given the opportunity to receive education beyond elementary level. In rare cases some black children received scholarships to attend secondary schools and later this offer was granted for them to attend universities. In contrast, sponsorships and grants for secondary schools today are based on tradition of the school. Throughout the Caribbean there exist traditional and non-traditional schools, newly constructed secondary schools. Within these schools there are vast disparity between opportunity and resources granted to persons attending school. In other words, there exist inequality and inequity within the education system. Resources are granted to traditional secondary schools while non-traditional secondary schools are just granted the basics which would just keep them afloat. The social space which held by the elite during the plantation system still exists today. The planters are replaced by the elite class. It is the elite class which controls production. The education of the masses is regulated with the vast differences in resources and opportunities granted within the education sphere. With the contrast in education between the elite and the masses today, the cycle of the elite managing all factors of production continues. The opportunity of the masses becoming too educated, revolting and becoming independent now looks like an uphill task. Indeed, the Caribbean society today assimilates the society which existed during the plantation slavery era. It is from this era the idea of a Creole society was also postulated and put forward by Caribbean sociologists. To suggest that the Caribbean exemplifies a Creole culture would be correct. It involves acculturation and interculturation of several cultures spanning several years. Acculturation as defined by sociologists is a process which connects different cultural groups and results in the acquisition of new cultural patterns by subordinate groups, while interculturation is defined as the mutual, symbiotic exchange of cultural traits. Although both are influenced by slavery, Creole societies and the plantation societies are two different societies. Even though there are differences, these two models are linked in a way. In the article entitled Caribbean Political Culture, Creolization came about as a result of slavery. Creolization can be regarded as the meeting of two cultures. The Caribbean was colonized by the British. It was the British who traded as used African labor for years. The conditions in which African laborers worked were regarded as slavery and were beneath how humans should treat each other. The existence of people, British, within the Caribbean meant the existence of a defined culture. The inclusion of Africans within the Caribbean meant the inclusion of an additional culture within the region. It should never be suggested or expected that while leaving Africa, Africans left their culture behind. Creole is described as a mixture of cultural expression. This may include language, dance, religion, music and norms. Creole throughout the Caribbean saw a culmination of African way of life with the European way of life. The inclusion of additional culture throughout the period of apprenticeship by virtue of indentureship further led to a complication of the Creolization of many societies throughout the Caribbean. Creolization is seen as a way of seeing the society, not in terms of white and black, master and slave, in separate nuclear units. It is seen as a contribution to the parts of the whole. It is with this ideology many Caribbean sociologists consider suggesting that the Caribbean do have a unique culture. Creolization of the Caribbean focuses more on the social sphere of the Caribbean rather than on the economic aspects. It is believed that the Caribbean has an inherent social culture but have experienced an evolving economic transformation. A clear example can be seen in religion. The British brought Christianity to the Caribbean. The ideology of the Taínos' belief in the Zemis was dashed aside with the arrival of the British within the Caribbean. The British brought African laborers, slaves, from Africa. The Africans brought their highly spiritualized lifestyle to the Caribbean. The values and ideology of the Christianity and African spirituality created several unique Caribbean religions. These include revivalism and Pacomania. A common colonial and Creole experience is shared between European and African descendants throughout the Caribbean region. Creolization began from the arrival of new members of the Caribbean region. The idea of Creolization of African slaves occurred in stages on the plantation. These stages included a period referred to as seasoning. This occurred when the slaves were branded, given a new name, a name of English origin, apprenticed to already Creolized slaves, taught the rudiments of the new language orally, and initiated into the relevant work routines. The stage was when slaves were induced to become identified with their work. The third stage is referred to as socialization. During this period slaves were encouraged to identify with their fellow slaves through the gang system. This was done through communal recreational activities such as drumming and dancing and festivals. The last stage of Creolization of African slaves was the stage known as identification. Each slave was identified and labeled accordingly. Slaves practiced mimicry on the sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean. This marked an era of transformation of inherent culture to the inclusion of a foreign way of life so as to feel important. It was never the belief of the Africans slaves that their culture was superior to their plantation owners' own culture. In attempt to be like their masters they even attempted their language. This resulted in a Creole language. In Jamaica the Creole language is known as patois. Slaves tried to uplift themselves psychologically from the plantation way of life by adopting some practices of the European colonizers. African slaves viewed their own culture as invisible. They view their master's culture as conceived of visibility imitating their everyday life. It would be a fallacy to believe that only the black slaves practiced mimicry on the sugar plantation. The white population of the day also practiced mimicry in the African slaves. The mimicry of the African language was the most common mimicry done by the white population. Sexual relationship between both blacks and whites during slavery further contributed to Creolization throughout the Caribbean. The relations between whites and blacks gave rise to a mixed population referred to as mulattoes. Most African slaves were of the belief that a little white purified the dark pigment within the color of their skin. They held in high regard anyone with a lightly colored skin or white. Regardless of the two societies discussed above, the pluralistic ideology have some validity in trying to understand the social relationships which exist throughout the Caribbean. The foundations of the theory of plural societies were laid by J.S. Furnivall, writing primarily about Indonesia, and M.G. Smith, writing about the British West Indies. A plural society refers to a composition of different ethnic groups or cultural traditions, or in the political structure of which ethnic or cultural differences are reflected. Britain has been developing into an increasingly plural society, with a major increase in the size of the non-white ethnic groups. There is a materialism, rationalism and individualism, and a concentration on economic ends far more complete and absolute than in homogeneous Western lands, a total absorption in the exchange and market, a capitalist structure with business concern as subject, far more typical of capitalism than one can imagine in the so-called capitalist societies which have grown slowly out of the past and are still bound to it by 100 roots. Pluralism views two aspects to the social structure of colonial societies. On the one hand there is the brutal world of the marketplace subject to no moral law, on the other there is the world of the separate communities within each of which there is tight moral control and a sense of belonging together. The idea of an uncaring society which is structured in classes exists. This ideology is what Marx and Engels rejected in their idea of a classless society. The division of labor facilitated the proletariats to become wealthy while the working classes remain poor. Uniformity within the social sphere regarding individual needs and achieve varied. This philosophy was embraced by Durkheim's theory or ideology of mechanical solidarity. Plural society refers to the issue of multicultural societies. The argument as to whether or not the Caribbean exists within a pluralistic paradigm can be easily settled by looking at the historical settings of the Caribbean region. The theory of pluralistic societies concentrates its attention upon differences in race and custom and upon group conflict, while at the same time directing attention away from the processes making for unity and integration in the society. M.G. Smith, 1960. Braithwaite, 1960. Suggests that every society has pluralistic aspects in the sense that different values and attitudes are produced by any functioning social system. This argument strengthens M.G. Smith, renowned Caribbean social anthropologist, that aspects of plurality exist throughout the Caribbean. With this comes the understanding that plurality within the Caribbean created a complex Caribbean culture. Plurality in society is further explained as having several ethnic and cultural categories. Both ethnic and cultural practices facilitate the varied social stratified societies throughout the Caribbean region. The stratification of the Caribbean society has been a byproduct of the pluralistic nature of the region. This has had great implications on the economics, language, education, religion and politics. The structured way of life of all societies throughout the Caribbean region has created a division of classes. This, according to Marx, separates the haves and the have-not. The poverty-stricken members of society can be identified by virtue of their education, religion, finances, language and politics. Throughout the pluralistic societies of the Caribbean, one of the prime requirements of social mobility is the association in which each member has. In addition to associations, symbols are used to help differentiate blocks of individuals within pluralistic contexts. It is important for sociologists to realize that pluralism appears to be unstable. Where political and economic conditions permit, pluralism tends to break down. Communication between sections increases, and common cultural forms develop. Groups and institutions cutting across sections foster this tendency toward fusion. where political and economic opportunities are distributed on the basis of ascribed ethnic or cultural status. Divisive tendencies develop. In the societies we describe as plural there are always tendencies in both directions. Within this plural society there exist conflicts. An argument put forward by social anthropologists is that as a region the Caribbean should consider creating a creation of homogeneous societies. A creation of homogeneous society would mean the division of a plural society into its constituent ethnic components, each as a sovereign society, would certainly, by definition, eliminate cultural diversity and ethnic conflict. Though such a partitioning does not guarantee the disappearance of conflict, it does ensure that conflict will no longer follow ethnic lines. Separatists throughout the world speak in these terms: Eritreans in Ethiopia, French Canadians in Quebec, Muslims in Chad, and Africans in the Sudan, to cite a few illustrations. But are their desires feasible and/or practicable? The answer appears to be no. It is the belief of many Caribbean historians that the pluralization of the Caribbean region began with the beginning of the exploration of the Western Hemisphere by Christopher Columbus in 1492. The complicated pluralism of the Caribbean region continued with the introduction of slavery within the region and later indentureship. It is the multicultural dimensions of the Caribbean region which have led to the pluralistic nature of the Caribbean region. Based on the arguments discussed, the Caribbean could be justly regarded as a multicultural region. The history of the Caribbean helps to establish the various social frameworks of all societies within the Caribbean region. The sociological theory of Marx and Engels can be easily applied when critically assessing the varied societies in existence throughout the Caribbean. Marx's view of society being enveloped by a social classes system is a reality. The plantation system, which saw the plantation owner at the upper hierarchy of the social class scale and the owner of all facets of production, paints a true visual imagery of Marx's theory. All planters geared their minds to achieve profit. The profits earned was never shared with the laborer/workers. The Creolization of the Caribbean region further points to the stratification of the Caribbean society. Creolization in the Caribbean was evident in several social institutions throughout the Caribbean during the early years of colonization of the Caribbean. These institutions included education, economic, politics, and the family. Creolization was found in varied music, art, dance and language within the Caribbean. The creolization of several societies within the Caribbean have led to the continuation of the lower class of each society throughout the Caribbean region, struggling to survive. This has been so due to the elite of the day finding it distasteful to welcome social mobility of individuals considered as Creole, not clearly defined. The above described attitude mirrors the ideology of the planters as they operated their plantations during the years of slavery. This ideology embraces the plantation-type society which benefits the owners of production. This view has strong sociological implication for the Caribbean region. This practice validates Karl Marx's theory of conflict and the need for the state to own all factors engaged in production of goods and service. The application of Karl Marx's theory/ideology eliminates the struggle between classes, gender and social classes. According to Marx, the state would manage the resources and everyone would be considered equal. Cuba took the initiative to follow Karl Marx's ideology. This led to a communist state. This decision has had grievous implication both socially and economically on the state of Cuba. Caribbean sociologists, in an attempt to understand the sociological framework of the Caribbean, have characterized it as pluralistic. The Caribbean is seen as a region with varied subcultures. These cultures exist primarily as a result of the practice of slavery within the region for over 200 years. The existence of pluralistic tendencies throughout the region has resulted in an explosion of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has resulted in inequity and inequality within many tenets of the Caribbean region. Social institutions found throughout the Caribbean are separated amongst ethnic and social backgrounds. A clear example can be seen amongst Indians and blacks in both Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. Within these two Caribbean states, for years there has been known tensions between the ethnic Indian clans and those persons with their ancestry stretching as back as the days of African slavery within the Caribbean, blacks. In several Caribbean states there has been continued rationalization of social responsibilities of those who are set in charge, the government. The elite ideological framework is always satisfied. The members of the impoverished lower caste are never usually considered when policy changes are considered and are implemented. The existence of inequity and inequality can easily be seen amongst members belonging to the lower caste of society. Equal opportunities are not granted to persons seeking employment, benefits and social services. The existence of these inequities throughout the Caribbean further promulgates the existence of a pluralistic society. One which favors persons belongs to a particular ethnic group. Many persons throughout the region have become so cognizant of the existence of these pluralistic tendencies they have opted to bleach their skin so as to resemble those in varied accepted ethnic groups. They have also attempted to adjust the looks of their hair, and other body parts. This has created a dull acceptance of being a member or associated with varied ethnic groups. The extent in which inequality exists in the Caribbean can also be attributed to pluralistic tendencies. As a result of the genealogical background coupled with social nepotism, it has been proven over the years that upward social mobility is impacted. The opportunity for promotion within the workplace lies within the reality of who you are, where do your family originate and how you look. The sharing of wealth outside ethnic boundaries has become a vice. The wealthy maintain their association with the wealthy by creating an imaginary boundary for all who seek to matriculate within their space. It is a fact that a wealthy family will never associate themselves with a person who became wealthy based on a lottery winning. The ethnicity of the individual and the idea that old money cannot mix with new money is a reality. The acceptance individuals within the higher social class take time and much effort. The fight for recognition creates a social conflict. The strategies now being employed by the elite class within the Caribbean in an effort to maintain their status creates as greater separation between themselves and the existing social classes. Many elites are now employing workers within establishments who are themselves elite. This has created an increase in the level of unemployment for the masses, the lower class. Should we now rethink as a region and embrace the idea of Karl Marx? Marx's ideology of having a state which is classless should eradicate pluralism, racism, gender discrimination and social inequality and inequity. Everyone within the region would be categorized under one umbrella. Or should we as a region continue to adopt the capitalistic perspective/culture and adhere to the principle of each man for himself, paying special interest in making profit and becoming successful? To a great extent, the view of Karl Marx seems logical and could be regarded as a solution to the ills of societal decay, inequality and inequity. This view put forward by Marx eliminates all tenets of the plantation, Creole and pluralist society. It also eliminates the division of the people based on ethnicity, race, gender and social diversity throughout the region. Any such undertaking throughout the Caribbean region would require significant willpower rather than a monopolistic system which shifts all operations to the leadership of the elite class again. A social partnership would be required so as to help to establish a cohesive transition of the existing system of governance now in place. This is necessary so as to establish a working relationship with all involved. The sectionalization of members throughout the Caribbean creates a hierarchy of social status. This has its advantages and disadvantages to the general society on the whole. The plantation society points to an economic, social and political plan which excluded the masses from participation. The Creolization of society occurred as a result of necessity. Individuals sought common grounds to interpret that which existed around them. The acculturalization of the dominant cultures throughout the Caribbean created an in-between culture. On the other hand, the pluralistic Caribbean society points to the varied ethnic experiences throughout the region. Indians, Europeans, Africans and Chinese to name a few help to construct the pluralistic nature of the Caribbean. The superior group view the practices of the other ethnic groups as cults and tradition. The social dynamics of the European culture have inspired adjustments in the cultural expression in existence within varied societies throughout the Caribbean. The ethnic backgrounds of the Caribbean region makes it difficult to agree to the notion that the Caribbean constitutes a defined culture.